Chapter 1. It was the sort of afternoon St. Aldred's prided itself on. A languid breeze drifting across manicured hedgerows, the scent of lemon drizzle cake wafting through open church hall windows, and the steady clatter of teacups punctuating polite conversation. The Stitching Society's summer social was, as always, a highlight in the village calendar. Mrs. Banbury Scott had outdone herself with embroidered bunting, and even the Reverend's notoriously gruff wife had contributed a plate of her infamous jam tarts, mostly to prove she still could. Miss Marple sat near the window, her knitting needles resting in her lap, although her hands remained conspicuously still. Her blue eyes, sharp as glass beneath the soft lace of her sun hat, moved quietly between the gathered crowd. "I dare say we'll see some quite marvellous entries this year," chirped young Alice Tremble, a mouse of a girl whose voice always seemed to tremble along with her surname. She gestured to the display table at the back, where lace doilies, tapestry samplers, and intricately patterned scarves vied for the blue ribbon. "Oh, yes," murmured Miss Marple. "Quite spirited, some of them." The spirit, however, was not entirely friendly. Over near the refreshments table, Mrs. Gilda Crowthorne was smiling much too widely at Agnes Weatherby, whose knitted blanket had already drawn murmurs of admiration. Gilda's smile was the kind that suggested anything but goodwill. She leaned in conspiratorially, brushing a crumb from Agnes's sleeve, her voice syrupy sweet. "You always manage to finish on time, don't you, dear? So efficient." Agnes returned the smile with equal sugar. "Unlike some, I don't have to rely on inspiration striking at midnight." Miss Marple's lips pursed ever so slightly, not in disapproval, but in recognition. Women, she often said, could exchange daggers under the guise of doilies. Near the samovar, Major Blenkinsop stood awkwardly beside widowed Mrs. Isabel Hawthorne, both of whom had contributed nothing to the stitching competition, but plenty to the gossip column that was Reverend Kinley's weekly sermon. Isabel had once been a dancer in London, and despite her claims of retirement, her bright silk scarf and coal-lined eyes told another story entirely. "I do admire a man with a steady hand," she purred, watching the Major pour his tea. He flushed crimson, sloshed the milk, and murmured something unintelligible about weather. As the clock struck 4, the judging commenced. Mrs. Banbury Scott, puffed with self-importance, announced the winner, Agnes Weatherby. Gilda Crowthorne's polite clapping sounded more like applause for a hanging. It was shortly after that, once the tea things were being cleared and the sunlight had begun to fade, that the first real discord slipped into the event. Gilda Crowthorne collapsed. It happened so quickly. One moment she was adjusting her brooch in the reflection of a silver teapot. The next she was gasping, clutching her throat, and sliding to the floor like a dropped curtain. The room erupted in gasps, half-finished sentences, and the clatter of teacups meeting saucers too fast. "Fetch Dr. Winsley!" someone cried. Miss Marple didn't move. She'd already begun to count the reactions. Agnes stood frozen, one hand clutching the edge of the tablecloth. Isabel Hawthorne's scarf fluttered as she turned sharply away. Alice Tremble had covered her mouth, her fingers twitching against her cheek. The Major was trying to kneel beside Gilda, but looked more like a man on the verge of collapse himself. By the time the doctor arrived, Gilda Crowthorne was gone, dead. "It must have been her heart," he said quickly, wiping his brow. "She's had trouble before, though I thought it under control. Likely a seizure." Most accepted this diagnosis without question, but not Miss Marple. Later that evening, back at her neat little cottage on the edge of the village, she examined her knitting basket. She hadn't dropped a single stitch all day. But there was something else that caught her attention, something she'd noticed during the judging. A single red thread, tangled, barely visible, clinging to Gilda's cardigan. It hadn't been there earlier, and Miss Marple, who had seen more than she let on, tucked it carefully into her sewing case. Chapter 2. By morning, the news had spread through St. Aldred's like blackberry jam on warm toast, thick, sticky, and impossible to ignore. Gilda Crowthorne, the ever-poised hostess and president of the Stitching Society, had died quite suddenly at the summer social. Most believed it was her heart, some her vanity. A few, in hushed tones behind their hedgerows, hinted at something darker. At the High Street post office, Mrs. Penelope Broadweather sorted mail with more flourish than usual, pausing on each letter as though it might contain some secret explanation. She was only 63, she said to Mrs. Drayton, who came, in for stamps but lingered for scandal. Too young for that sort of thing, really, though I suppose stress can do funny things. Mrs. Drayton leaned in. Stress, yes. Or spite. You know how Gilda was, always needling poor Agnes. Did you? Here she won this year. Won and lived to regret it, I dare say, Penelope whispered. Meanwhile, Agnes Weatherby had taken to her garden, pruning her delphiniums with surgical precision. She'd declined to speak to anyone that morning, save for a curt word to the grocer and a brisk nod to the vicar's wife. Her hands, usually steady, nicked a rose stem too sharply. A crimson drop bloomed on her glove. She stared at it for a moment before resuming her cutting. Miss Marple, for her part, had made no grand pronouncements. She attended the early service, took her usual walk along Larkspur Lane, and was now sipping her mid-morning tea while leafing through an old gardening journal. The red thread from Gilda's cardigan sat neatly pressed between two pages, marked with a petal of forget-me-not. She wasn't waiting for anything in particular, but she knew the village would come to her. It always did. At precisely 11 o'clock, the doorbell chimed. "Miss Marple, I do hope I'm not interrupting." It was Alice Tremble, clutching a parcel and a nervous expression. Miss Marple welcomed her in with a warm smile, and the offer of a scone. Alice declined both. "It's terrible, isn't it?" she blurted. "About Gilda. I've hardly slept." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Oh dear, you saw quite a lot yesterday, I imagine. So near the display table." Alice nodded, eyes wide. "I was rearranging the lavender sachets when it happened. I didn't even see her fall, just heard the gasp." And before that? Well, Gilda was fussing with the entries, said something about someone tampering. She didn't say who, but she seemed flustered. Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but a subtle interest lit her gaze. Tampering, did she? I think she meant the judging cards. I noticed hers looked smudged, but I didn't think anything of it. Alice fidgeted. Agnes was nearby, though. And I did hear them arguing last week in the greengrocer's." Miss Marple folded her hands over her lap. People often say more with tone than with words. What was the nature of their disagreement? Alice paused, as though recalling a tune half forgotten. Something about a pattern, a stitching pattern. Gilda said Agnes had copied it. Agnes said it was public domain. I didn't understand half of it, but Gilda was furious. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And yet she awarded her the prize. "Ah, under protest, I'd wager," Alice whispered. Her smile looked thin. When Alice left, Miss Marple returned to her journal. Her tea had gone cold. She didn't seem to notice. At the vicarage, Reverend Kinley paced the length of his study, rehearsing lines for Sunday's sermon. "Community, unity, the fragility of life," he mumbled, scratching his chin. Outside, his wife was conversing with Isabel Hawthorne over the garden hedge. "I don't care what the doctor says," Isabel declared, her voice floating over the petunias. Gilda didn't just keel over from nerves. That woman could weather a hurricane if it meant getting her way. Mrs. Kinley raised an eyebrow. "You suspect something?" "I suspect everyone," Isabel said with a dark chuckle. "Isn't that the fun of it?" Inside her neat cottage, Miss Marple set down the journal. She stood and moved to her sewing table, selecting a small swatch of linen and threading a needle. Her fingers worked with practised ease, but her thoughts were elsewhere, tampering with judging cards. A public argument, a convenient collapse, all very ordinary on the surface. Yet something about Gilda's final moments clung like that red thread. The truth was unravelling, even if no one had noticed the stitch had come loose. Chapter 3. The village of St. Aldred's was not one to let a death rest quietly, especially one as sudden and socially significant as Gilda Crowthorne's. 2 days had passed, and already the rhythm of daily life had subtly shifted. Conversations that once fluttered with talk of jam recipes and summer rain now tiptoed around words like motive and poison. The coroner's preliminary findings, cardiac arrest, pending toxicology, had only added fuel to the whispering fire. Gilda had no known heart condition. Dr. Winsley's earlier assumption now seemed hasty. In the Morning Post, Miss Marple received a brief, rather apologetic note from Inspector Crail of the County Constabulary. He would be informally reviewing the incident that afternoon. A formality, he insisted, but one must be thorough. Miss Marple tucked the note beneath her sugar bowl and stepped out to the baker's, where half the village just happened to be loitering. "Morning, Miss Marple," called Cyril Drew, the postman, pretending to inspect the marmalade display. "Dreadful business about Gilda?" "Yes," she said lightly, selecting a seeded loaf. "A most unexpected sort of death. But then, life does have its little surprises." Outside she ran into Major Blenkinsop, who was less composed. His hat was slightly askew, and he clutched his walking stick with white-knuckled tension. "So, Marple," he began abruptly, "may I have a word?" She offered a gentle nod, and they stepped aside near the hedgerow. I must say, I didn't much care for the way Gilda looked at me that afternoon. Before it happened. Suspiciously. No, knowingly, as if she had something on me. And now I find myself wondering if she planned to say it aloud. Miss Marple studied him, noting the tremor in his voice. Not fear, precisely, but a fraying edge of uncertainty. "People often wait too long to say what matters," she said, "or they say it when it's already too late." "I've nothing to hide," the Major added quickly. "But that doesn't mean I want to be dragged into things. The village loves a scapegoat." "Indeed, but scapegoats rarely look quite so flustered." His mouth opened, closed again. Then, muttering something about his rheumatism, he made a hasty retreat. Miss Marple didn't pursue the matter. She'd seen the way his eyes flicked, not toward the church, as one might expect, but toward the old haberdashery now shuttered at the corner. Back home, she found a visitor waiting. Agnes Weatherby stood at the garden gate, her gloved hands folded neatly over her handbag. "May I come in?" Miss Marple led her to the sitting-room without question. "I thought it best to be direct," Agnes said once they were seated. "I know people are talking." "People always talk," Miss Marple replied, pouring tea. "It's only a matter of whether one listens." Agnes accepted her cup without sugar. "Gilda and I had our differences, that's no secret, but I had no reason to harm her, certainly not over a stitching prize." Miss Marple said nothing, but Agnes filled the silence with haste. "You've heard about the pattern, I imagine. The argument. She accused me of stealing a design. It wasn't true. The pattern's from a French magazine published in 1931. Anyone could use it." "And yet she was quite convinced you'd stolen it." "She was convinced of many things. Gilda saw enemies in shadows." Agnes paused. "And secrets where there were none." "Were there truly none?" Agnes stiffened. "I came to defend myself, not confess to fantasies." She stood, but Miss Marple's voice stopped her. "Before you go, you wouldn't happen to know who stitched the redwork piece beside Gilda's cardigan, would you? I noticed it had been moved." "Slightly." Agnes blinked, surprised. "That was mine. A sampler. I didn't notice anything out of place." Miss Marple smiled. "Things often move without us noticing." Agnes left shortly after, and Miss Marple returned to her sewing cabinet. The red thread was still there, along with something new, a copy of the judging sheets she had borrowed from Mrs. Banbury Scott under the guise of preserving village history. Gilda's entry had no marks beside it, no comments, just a faint crease, as though the paper had been folded or tampered with. She turned to the redwork entry. Agnes's handwriting was unmistakable on the back, but someone had added a tiny star next to the score, almost invisible. A private mark. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window. Inspector Crail would arrive soon, eager to question the obvious. But Miss Marple had already begun listening for the quiet sounds, the things left unsaid, the gestures too rehearsed, the glances that gave too much away. The truth, she knew, rarely arrived with a knock. It slipped through the cracks. Chapter 4. Inspector Crail arrived promptly at 3 o'clock, just as Miss Marple had anticipated, a tall man with a weathered trench coat and a moustache that twitched when he was thinking too hard. Crail believed firmly in method over intuition, a principle that rarely served him well in villages like St. Aldred's. He accepted Miss Marple's offer of tea, though he barely sipped it. His attention was already consumed by a small leather notebook, in which he had jotted down what he referred to as primary persons of interest. "Just to be thorough, you understand," he said, though his tone carried the weight of premature certainty. In cases like this, well, the closer the circle, the likelier the culprit. Miss Marple, sitting with her hands folded over her embroidery hoop, smiled politely. "You sound very certain, Inspector. Patterns, Miss Marple. People follow them. And when a woman dies at a public event, within arm's reach of half the village, it's almost always something personal." He flipped open his notebook. "We've got 3 names floating to the top. Agnes Weatherby. Obvious friction with the deceased. Argument on record. Motive plausible. Then there's Isabel Hawthorne. Apparently had a public falling out with Gilda several months ago over some artistic disagreement." "Artistic?" Miss Marple inquired, eyebrows lifting gently. Crail cleared his throat. "She accused Gilda of copying one of her scarf designs and passing it off as original at last year's county fair." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Gilda was never fond of being outshone." "Exactly. And finally," Crail continued, "Major Blenkinsop. Apparently he and the deceased were once involved." "A rumour I've heard as well," Miss Marple said mildly. Crail frowned. "If you have anything concrete, Miss Marple, I hope you'll share it with me." "I believe concrete things tend to float to the surface when you stir the water gently," she said, looking over the rim of her teacup. Undeterred, Crail closed his notebook and stood. "I'll be making visits this evening. In the meantime, if you think of anything." She gave a pleasant nod, watching as he strode back down the cobbled path, notebook in hand and certainty in step. That evening, the village watched Crail's silhouette move from door to door like a spectre of uncomfortable questions. By sunset, whispers were already circulating that he had spoken to Agnes for nearly an hour, and left without shaking her hand. But it was Isabel Hawthorne who came to Miss Marple's doorstep just after twilight, trailing a thin cloud of lilac, perfume and cigarette smoke. "He questioned me like I'd laced her tea with arsenic," she said, flopping into the armchair without invitation. "As if a scarf design's worth a murder charge." Miss Marple offered her a calm glance. "You did call her a fraud, I believe." "Oh, I've called half the village frauds at one point or another. Doesn't mean I poisoned them." Isabel crossed her legs and lit another cigarette. "Besides, Gilda and I had an understanding." "Do you mean friendship?" "I mean mutual leverage." Isabel exhaled a stream of smoke. "She had something on me. I had something on her. That's how it worked." Miss Marple remained quiet. Isabel leaned forward. "I know you know what I mean. You always do. That's why I came. Whatever killed her, if it wasn't natural, it wasn't about some ribbon competition. This was deliberate." She stubbed her cigarette out in the saucer Miss Marple had discreetly set out just in time. "Someone wanted her quiet, permanently." "And you think that someone wasn't you? I'm reckless, not foolish. You don't kill people like Gilda. They leave too many ghosts." After she left, Miss Marple sat in silence. Outside, the night deepened. A cat yowled somewhere near the post office. A bicycle clattered past, then came a knock. It was the Reverend Kinley. He looked rather embarrassed, his hat in his hand. "I hope I'm not intruding, Miss Marple. Only something's come to light." She gestured him inside. He hesitated. "During the final hymn yesterday, one of the choir boys, George, admitted he saw Gilda arguing with someone just before the social, in the vestry. Who? Mrs. Banbury Scott. Miss Marple blinked. That is new. She didn't report it. George said they were whispering sharply. Something about a list. He thought it was about seating charts, but, well, Gilda looked frightened. Miss Marple's fingers tapped once against her saucer. "Thank you, Reverend. That's very helpful." When he had gone, she retrieved the judging forms again, laying them out on the table like puzzle pieces. One form had a tiny smudge in the margin. A thumbprint, she thought, though not Gilda's. Mrs. Banbury Scott had never seemed the type to raise her voice, let alone her hand. But then Miss Marple knew better than most. Poison wasn't always in the teacup. Sometimes it lay in the silence between stitches. Chapter 5. The following morning brought a chill that seemed out of place for late summer. An omen, some would have said, had they been inclined toward dramatics. But Miss Marple, who believed more in human nature than the weather, took it simply as a sign to wear her heavier cardigan. She sat near the hearth with her embroidery basket in her lap. The red thread still tucked safely inside its hidden pocket. It was not the thread itself that puzzled her. It was its placement, its timing, and the question no one else had asked. Why would it be on Gilda's cardigan at all? Miss Marple had seen Gilda that morning, pristine as ever, without a stitch of red on her. The cardigan had been pale beige, carefully chosen to match her brooch, yet after the collapse the thread had been there, clinging near the left shoulder like a faint accusation. She was still turning that thought over when a knock came at the door. It was Mrs. Banbury Scott, dressed in lavender and looking paler than usual. "Miss Marple, I do hope I'm not disturbing you," she said with an over-tight smile. "But I was hoping for your advice. Social advice, that is." "Of course," Miss Marple said gently. "Do come in." The woman seated herself with the careful grace of someone used to managing appearances. "It's just, with everything that's happened and the committee in such a state, I fear we must postpone the upcoming Stitching Society exhibition, at least until the inquest is over." "Quite understandable," Miss Marple replied. "Tragedy has a way of unravelling even the tidiest plans." Mrs. Banbury Scott flinched slightly at the word unravelling, and Miss Marple noted it. "I suppose the inspector has already visited you?" she added mildly. "He did, briefly." Her fingers twitched in her lap. "He asked about a conversation I had with Gilda in the vestry. I told him it was about the seating arrangements for the judging table. Nothing more." Miss Marple didn't challenge the answer. "You and Gilda were close, were you not?" "We worked together for years. We were cordial, efficient." A pause. "Not friends, precisely." There was something brittle in her voice, as though she were holding something back, not because it was incriminating, but because it was humiliating. Miss Marple let the silence hang. Then, "She threatened to expose me," Mrs. Banbury Scott blurted. "There, I've said it." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, not in surprise, but in silent encouragement. "She found out I'd submitted a needlepoint last year that wasn't entirely mine," she continued in a low voice. "My cousin helped me finish it. Just a few rows, really. But Gilda insisted it was fraud. Said if I didn't support her choice for this year's winner, she'd make it public." "And did you support her choice?" Mrs. Banbury Scott's eyes darted. I tried, but the other judges favoured Agnes. I couldn't overturn them all, so I smudged the judging card, tried to make it unreadable, hoping it would cause confusion. Gilda must have noticed, and threatened to tell. She nodded. But I didn't kill her, I swear it. Miss Marple believed her. The woman had the anxious energy of someone who had done something wrong, but not something fatal. After she left, Miss Marple turned once again to the judging cards. The smudge was still faintly visible on Agnes's sheet. But that wasn't what held her attention now. It was the redwork sampler Agnes had entered. Miss Marple had asked to borrow it for documentation purposes, and it now lay folded beside the basket. She examined the stitching closely. The pattern itself was a floral motif, roses and ivy intertwined around the initials AW. But in the lower left corner, a single rose had been outlined in red thread, instead of the pale pink used. In the rest, at first glance, it appeared an artistic choice. But Miss Marple knew Agnes's work. It was meticulous, traditional. She would never introduce a colour change without intention. She leaned closer. One of the loops had been unpicked and restitched. Sloppily, someone had tampered with the sampler. Recently. She opened her sewing case, removed the thread she had taken from Gilda's cardigan, and held it against the red rose, a perfect match. Miss Marple's expression remained placid, but her mind was sharpening like a well-honed needle. The thread was not a trace left behind. It was a transfer, a connection. Someone had handled both the sampler and Gilda's cardigan in the same breath, and not by accident. Later that afternoon, as she passed the churchyard on her walk, she saw Agnes standing alone by the low stone wall, speaking in hushed tones to none other than Alice Tremble. Their faces were tight with something unspoken. Alice glanced up and saw Miss Marple. Her smile was quick, forced. Agnes did not turn. The web was tightening. Threads were crossing, and somewhere in the weave the truth waited to be pulled loose. Chapter 6. St. Aldred's had always been a place where secrets didn't stay buried. They simply wore hats and took longer routes home. With the inquest looming and the inspector's inquiries stirring unease, villagers moved through their daily routines with a kind of stiff politeness, each greeting now laced with suspicion. Miss Marple, however, found that people often revealed more when trying to conceal. That morning, she attended the village's book swap at the community hall, not for literature, but for observation. Agnes Weatherby was there, as expected, neatly browsing the gardening section. Alice Tremble hovered close behind her, clearly agitated, fidgeting with her cardigan buttons. "Agnes!" Miss Marple greeted, lightly tapping the spine of herbs for the hardy border. "How thoughtful of you to come. I'd imagine these gatherings are difficult at the moment." Agnes looked up, cool but polite. "I see no reason to avoid town life. People will think what they like." Alice, too quick to respond, chimed in. "They shouldn't think anything. None of it was your fault." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on Alice. "Oh, what part of it, dear?" Alice's cheeks flushed. "I just meant the rumours about the judging. It wasn't Agnes's doing. She simply entered a fine piece." Agnes's expression barely changed, but her grip on the book tightened. Miss Marple didn't press the moment. "Yes, quite a fine piece. The red work in particular was rather striking. Neither woman replied. She turned away, pretending to browse, though her mind remained on that sampler. The single red rose, the tampered stitch, it hadn't been altered for aesthetics. It had been used, and whoever had handled it had left behind more than thread. They'd left intent. Outside the hall, she caught sight of Major Blenkinsop, pacing beside the war memorial, his brow furrowed, hat pulled low. She approached him casually. "Major," she said, "you look like a man searching for peace and not finding much." He gave a start, then chuckled nervously. "Old habits, I suppose. Never quite adjusted to quiet." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "You've lived here quite a while. Known Gilda well." His eyes flicked to hers. "Well enough." "Someone mentioned you were once close." He hesitated. "Long ago. Nothing improper. But yes, there was a time. And yet, after all these years, I wonder why she still had your monogrammed handkerchief in her handbag the day she died." His head snapped toward her. Miss Marple's tone didn't shift. "You left it behind at the summer social, didn't you? I noticed it under the tablecloth where Gilda collapsed. The initials were faded but distinct." The Major paled. She asked to speak with me privately that day. I was trying to avoid a scene. She'd threatened to dredge up old things. Thought I owed her support for something." "What sort of support?" "She wanted me to back her for chairmanship of the parish council next term. Said she had information that could ruin others if needed." He ran a hand down his face. "I told her blackmail was a dangerous game." Miss Marple nodded. "And did she mention what she knew?" "Just that it involved someone high in the stitching society. She was vague, smug. I assumed it was Banbury Scott. Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured, "or perhaps she was bluffing to test reactions." That afternoon Miss Marple visited the church vestry under the guise of donating old hymnals, while, placing them on a shelf, she noticed a scrap of embroidery floss caught on the corner of the pew bench. Red, slightly frayed. Unusual, given Gilda's taste leaned toward neutrals. She carefully folded it in tissue and returned home, where she laid it beside the thread from Gilda's cardigan and the redwork sampler. All identical. That evening, while most of the village was indoors avoiding the autumn chill, Miss Marple strolled past the Weatherby cottage. A flicker of light in the upstairs window drew her eye. Agnes stood there alone, her back to the glass, examining something small in her hand, something crimson. She tucked it quickly into a drawer when Alice entered the room behind her. From where Miss Marple stood, unseen by either, the image held for only a second, but it was enough. Secrets had weight, and in a village as small as St. Aldred's, they couldn't be buried long. They shifted, revealed themselves in glances and gestures, in sudden silences and misjudged words. Gilda had known something dangerous enough that someone decided silence was safer than exposure. And Miss Marple had just begun to see the shape of that silence. Chapter 7. The inquest had been scheduled for Thursday morning, and the village buzzed with a peculiar mixture of anticipation and dread. Yet before the gavel could fall, and the coroner could declare Gilda Crowthorne's death, either tragic or criminal, something else occurred. Something no one in St. Aldred's had expected. On Tuesday evening, the vicarage maid discovered a note tucked behind the organ bench. It was short and unsigned. She knew too much. I only meant to frighten her. Not that. Inspector Crail was summoned at once. He read the note twice beneath the flickering vestry light, his frown deepening with every word. "Found here?" he asked. "The maid." "Yes, sir," she replied nervously. "Just there. It must have slipped behind after the Sunday service. I was polishing the floor when I noticed it." Crail summoned Reverend Kinley next, who claimed no knowledge of the handwriting. Miss Marple, of course, heard about the note before breakfast. By midday, the news had reached every kitchen table in the village. At 2:30, Alice Tremble arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, alone this time, pale and trembling more than usual. "They found a note," she said without preamble. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "So I've heard." Alice hesitated on the edge of her chair. I think it might have been about the sampler." Miss Marple watched her closely. "Go on. I didn't tell you everything. The red thread, it wasn't part of the original design. I added it, just one rose. Agnes told me to, said it would make the piece stand out to the judges. Was that the only reason?" Alice hesitated. She also said, if it came up later, it could prove the piece had been tampered with, that it might discredit Gilda. I didn't understand what she meant at the time, but now— Why not say this before? Because I didn't want to believe it mattered. I didn't want it to be about me. Miss Marple's voice was kind but firm. When people are afraid, they often become part of the very thing they fear. Alice began to cry quietly. That evening, as dusk fell like a soft veil over the village, Green Miss Marple went for a walk. Her path led her, perhaps coincidentally, past Agnes Weatherby's garden gate. Agnes was pruning again. The roses were browning at the tips. "Miss Marple," she said without looking up, "come to inspect my methods." "I find gardening reveals more about a person than gossip ever could," Miss Marple replied. "What we cultivate, what we bury." Agnes clipped a wilted bloom. "Then you must think me very practical." "I think you're someone who doesn't like loose ends." Agnes paused, then straightened. "If you have something to ask me, do it plainly." Miss Marple met her gaze. "What did Gilda have on you?" There was a long silence. The breeze stirred the lavender. "She had a letter," Agnes said finally, "from years ago. One I wrote in confidence to a certain committee, questioning another woman's financial dealings. Gilda found it, don't ask how, and threatened to expose me as a troublemaker. Said it would ruin my chance at chairing next spring's district panel. Did you ask her to reconsider? I asked her to burn it." She laughed. She said she'd hold it for leverage. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And the sampler? The red thread?" "I didn't alter it. Not after I submitted it. But someone did." Agnes's voice dropped. "I think she meant to accuse me publicly, embarrass me." "And Alice? She's a child, Miss Marple, loyal and frightened. I didn't want her caught up in this." Miss Marple didn't reply. Instead, she looked past the garden wall toward the sky, which had deepened to violet. Later that night, as the village settled into uneasy slumber, another discovery was made. The postman, Cyril Drew, found it while collecting the outgoing mail from the box near the church. An envelope. No address, no stamp. only a name in looping cursive, Miss Marple. Inside, a single item, a torn corner of embroidery linen, with a rose stitched in red, and a smear of dried blood near the edge. Chapter 8. Miss Marple examined the torn linen by candlelight, the faint red smear at the edge catching the glow like dried rust. The stitching was identical to the sampler Agnes had entered, same thread, same rose motif. But this fragment was rough, hastily cut, the kind of damage born not from accident but panic. Someone had tried to remove a piece of evidence. And now, curiously, they were giving it back. She slipped the fabric into an envelope and sealed it without a label. Not yet. By the following morning, the village had grown restless. The vicar's wife no longer asked after guests' health, only if they'd heard anything new. At the market, even the butcher's lad spoke of Gilda Crowthorne as if she were already legend, whispering about curses stitched into samplers and poisoned, preserves. But Miss Marple was neither distracted nor deterred. She knew the moment had arrived to draw the web tighter, not by force, by patience, observation, and the power of suggestion. At precisely noon, she arranged a small gathering in the church hall under the pretence of preparing a tribute for Gilda. Memorial stitching square, something for the altar cloth. She told the committee Agnes Weatherby, Mrs. Banbury Scott, Isabel Hawthorne, Alice Tremble, and even Major Blenkinsop arrived, each out of obligation or curiosity. Inspector Crail, having heard about the event through village chatter, arrived late but lingered near the back with arms folded, sensing something was afoot. Miss Marple placed a basket of threads on the table, including one particular spool, identical to the red used in the rose. Then, as the others sorted fabric scraps and discussed patterns, she gently held up the torn piece of embroidery. "This arrived anonymously," she said, her tone calm. "Unusual, isn't it? A rose torn from the centre of a larger sampler." And stained, the conversation stilled. No one moved. "I believe it's from the piece Agnes submitted," she continued, "though someone clearly altered it after submission, and then, it seems, panicked." Agnes looked as if she might speak, but Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Alice. The girl sat rigidly, hands clenched in her lap. "I imagine the person who did this never meant to harm anyone. But once Gilda discovered it, once she realized someone had tampered with a public entry, well, the threat of exposure became rather dangerous." A soft scrape of a chair leg broke the silence. Isabel Hawthorne crossed her arms. "What are you saying, Miss Marple? That someone changed a thread and killed for it?" "Not for the thread," Miss Marple said gently. "For what it implied. The thread was the means. The motive was fear." She turned to Alice, but didn't speak. Instead, she offered her the torn linen. The girl's lip trembled, but she didn't reach for it. "It wasn't supposed to happen," Alice said quietly, her voice so low it nearly disappeared. She was only meant to be discredited. Agnes said if her sampler looked suspicious, the judges might think Gilda rigged the results. But then, Gilda saw me near the basket. She followed me. She confronted me in the vestry. Crail stepped forward, face tense. What happened then? Alice shook her head. She shouted, said she knew I'd interfered. She grabbed my arm. I panicked. I shoved her. She fell against the pew. I ran. I didn't mean to. Truly, I didn't. Miss Marple watched her without judgment. You stitched the red thread yourself, at Agnes's request. Alice nodded. Only that rose. She said it would look like a careless sabotage if Gilda tried to claim the design was hers. I thought it was harmless. Agnes stood up then, too quickly. I never told her to confront Gilda. I never meant for it to go that far. Miss Marple held up a hand. You manipulated the setting, Mrs. Weatherby. You let the pieces fall as they might, but Alice was the one who placed the final stitch, and the final push. Crail stepped forward to make it official. But the moment had already passed. The truth had unravelled quietly. In a room filled with thread and silence, Alice offered no resistance. Her confession, once spoken, seemed to drain the tension from her frame. Miss Marple turned back to the group. There's a kind of tragedy in quiet intentions. People don't always mean to kill, but fear stitches its own patterns. As the others filed out, subdued and shaken, Miss Marple remained behind, collecting the stray threads and folding the linen carefully. The sampler would not be completed now, but the mystery was, almost at Chapter 9, the morning after Alice Tremble's quiet confession, St. Aldred's awoke under a sombre sky. Rain clouds hung low over the thatched roofs, and the church bells, which usually rang brightly on Thursdays for midday prayer, stayed eerily silent. Though Alice had been escorted gently to the station by Inspector Crail, there was no public scandal, no cuffs, no headlines, no satisfaction in punishment, only whispers, the kind that never truly died in a village like St. Aldred's. Miss Marple, however, had one final visit to make before she allowed the matter to settle. Not to Inspector Crail, not to the Reverend, but to Agnes Weatherby. She found Agnes in the sitting-room of her ivy-covered cottage, staring out the window, with a half-finished cup of tea gone cold on the table. "I suppose you've come to scold me," Agnes said, her voice low and colourless. "No, dear," Miss Marple replied. "I've come to tell you how the pattern finally came together." Agnes didn't look away from the rain-dappled glass. It was never meant to happen like this. Miss Marple took the chair opposite her. "And yet you orchestrated it quite deliberately, didn't you? You knew Gilda was threatening your reputation. You'd heard her boasting to Major Blenkinsop, even to Mrs. Banbury Scott. You couldn't discredit her outright, not without appearing petty. So you used something that would cast doubt, something that could be dismissed as clumsy sabotage." Agnes's fingers tightened around the teacup. "You had Alice add the red thread, a single rose in a different colour, small enough not to ruin the piece, but large enough to raise suspicion if Gilda noticed it before the judging. And she did, of course." Agnes looked down. "She always noticed everything." "You counted on it," Miss Marple said gently. "But what you didn't count on was how frightened Alice would become when Gilda confronted her. You didn't tell her to push Gilda, but you placed her in that situation all the same." Agnes looked up, eyes rimmed with red. "Do you think I meant for her to die?" Miss Marple shook her head. "I think you meant to wound her pride, perhaps embarrass her publicly. You believed she'd retaliate with fury, and the village would finally see how vindictive she could be. But fate, you see, rarely respects intentions." Agnes sat back, the confession wordless but complete. "She was cruel, she whispered after a moment. To all of us. She hoarded secrets like trophies. She thought power came from knowing what others couldn't afford to share. And yet, Miss Marple replied softly, for all her cruelty, she didn't deserve to die for it. There was silence between them, broken only by the rhythmic tapping of rain against the window pane. The village beyond blurred into a soft wash of grey. After a long pause, Agnes spoke again. What happens now? Inspector Crail believes Alice acted in a moment of panic, Miss Marple said. There will be a hearing, likely lenient. The court may see it as an accident, an unfortunate consequence of pressure and fear. And me? Miss Marple regarded her calmly. Your part may never see daylight, unless Alice names you, which she hasn't. But guilt, Agnes, has a way of stitching itself into one's conscience. Agnes didn't respond. Miss Marple stood collecting her gloves. If you ever feel the need to confess, do it not for the law, but for yourself. You cannot unpick what's been done, but you can choose not to weave more silence into your life. She left the house without waiting for a reply. Outside, the rain had begun to ease, leaving behind the sharp smell of wet stone and earth. Miss Marple walked back to her cottage with quiet purpose. The pieces of the mystery finally aligned, their jagged edges joined with a terrible kind of symmetry. Gilda Crowthorne had sown the seeds of her own undoing. But it was fear, not hate, that had tightened the final knot, and in the end, it was not a knife or poison that killed her. It was a thread. Chapter 10. 2 days later, the inquest was held in the parish hall under leaden skies. A fire had been lit, though it did little to warm the stiff-backed chairs or the mood of those gathered. Inspector Crail stood near the front, lips drawn into a line, occasionally scribbling notes. Reverend Kinley offered the opening prayer, more subdued than usual. The villagers sat in silent rows, their eyes flicking toward the empty chair reserved for Alice Tremble. Miss Marple did not speak at the inquest. She sat quietly near the rear, a small black notebook tucked inside her, handbag unopened. She had no intention of airing every thread in public, only the ones that mattered. The coroner read aloud the results of the post-mortem. No signs of traditional poison, no external injuries. Heart failure was the official cause of death, brought on, so the report stated, by extreme stress and physical trauma. But it was the testimony of one nervous constable, sent to retrieve Gilda's effects from the vestry, that drew murmurs. A torn piece of embroidery, discovered behind the pew, and a smudge of dried blood too faint to test. By the end, the verdict was rendered, death by misadventure. Miss Marple left quietly, declining the offers of tea and gentle chatter that usually followed such events. She had one last appointment before she could consider the matter truly finished. That afternoon, she invited Inspector Crail to her cottage under the pretence of returning a teacup he'd once left behind. He accepted, albeit with raised eyebrows. Bit of an anticlimax, wasn't it? He said, sitting stiffly in the floral armchair. A note, a confession, but no proof anyone meant for it to happen. The magistrate says it's best to leave it at that. Miss Marple poured him tea, but didn't yet drink her own. It's not always the law that settles things, Inspector, she said. Sometimes it's understanding the shape of the story. and why it had to end the way it did. Say, gave a non-committal grunt. Miss Marple opened her notebook. Neatly in columns, she'd written 3 headings: motive, means, and opportunity. Let us say, she began gently, that Gilda Crowthorne was a woman of influence in her small domain. She collected secrets, leveraged people's fears. When she threatened Agnes Weatherby's ambitions, Agnes looked for a method that would shame her publicly, not kill her. Crail folded his arms. You believe Agnes orchestrated the red thread business? Indeed. She had Alice alter the sampler just enough to suggest tampering. It would cast doubt on Gilda's integrity without openly accusing her. A clever, deniable trick. But it backfired. Spectacularly, Miss Marple agreed. Gilda saw the stitch, realized it was no accident. She confronted Alice in private, likely with anger, perhaps even physical force. And Alice, already feeling the pressure of her complicity, panicked. Crail sighed. So, it was the push, then? Yes, she said, a moment of desperation. No weapon, no intent to kill, but enough to trigger a fall. Gilda was a woman of frail health beneath her polish. The trauma tipped the balance. He rubbed his brow. So why the linen? The rose? To silence doubt, Miss Marple replied. Alice mailed it to me after the fact, perhaps as a form of penance, perhaps hoping I would understand the full truth and do what the law could not. Crail stared into his teacup for a long moment. You're a strange one, Miss Marple. I've simply lived long enough to recognize the ways. People hide themselves, she said, with smiles, with stitching, even with silence. He stood, thanked her quietly, and left. He would not file a report on Agnes Weatherby. He would not summon Alice back for further questioning. The law had spoken, and so, in its way, had justice. Miss Marple sat back and allowed herself a moment of stillness. Outside, the rain had cleared. The sun broke timidly through the clouds, catching on the threads of a small sampler on her mantle, an old one, done in youthful hands. She studied the rose at its centre, stitched in soft pink. Uniform, precise. She thought of Alice's trembling hands, Agnes's cold calculations, and Gilda's sharp smile. People spoke often of the truth as something that came to light, but Miss Marple knew better. The truth didn't reveal itself. It was drawn out, one stitch at a time. Chapter 11. For a few days, life in St. Aldred's returned to its careful rhythm. The bakery reopened with a 2-for-1 offer on lemon scones. The church bell resumed its measured chimes. Mrs. Banbury Scott announced the next Stitching Society meeting, omitting any mention of Gilda Crowthorne. Silence had become the village's preferred form of closure. But not everyone could pretend. So neatly, Agnes Weatherby had not been seen at her garden gate since the inquest. The roses, once fiercely trimmed, began to wilt in their beds. Her curtains remained drawn even during daylight, and when Mrs. Drayton brought by a jar of jam and a polite excuse for company, she was turned away without a word. Miss Marple, observing from her front-room window with quiet clarity, understood this was not a woman grieving the death of another. It was a woman grieving the image of herself she could no longer believe in. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a walk, unhurried as always, and arrived at the Weatherby doorstep with a paper bag tucked under her arm. Agnes opened the door after a long pause, eyes ringed with fatigue. She said nothing but stepped aside. Miss Marple took a seat without waiting to be offered. "I brought you a cutting," she said, withdrawing a small potted ivy plant from the west wall of my garden, hardy, good at hiding damage beneath its leaves. Agnes sat across from her. "You think I'm hiding?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "I think you've always stitched things to cover the truth. A misplaced stitch here, a flattering entry there. Enough to keep the pattern intact. But now the canvas has torn, and no thread can repair it." Agnes looked down at her hands, folded tightly in her lap. "Do you know what I can't stop thinking about? That I didn't even like Gilda. Not really. And yet she has ruined me." "Gilda didn't ruin you," Miss Marple said softly. "She only revealed who you were willing to be when frightened." Agnes flinched. "I never told Alice to push her." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But you chose to weave a scheme where someone else would carry your thread, and it snagged." Silence filled the room like fog. After a time, Miss Marple stood. "I imagine you'll be resigning from the Stitching Society." Agnes gave a dry, hollow laugh. "I doubt I'd be welcomed. Oh, I think they'll allow you to fade out gently. People do like their scandals neat and quiet, especially in places like ours." At the door, Miss Marple paused. "You'll need to find another outlet, some way to unburden. I'd recommend volunteering at the hospital. Clean linens, no embroidery involved, just the truth of care." Agnes didn't reply, but her chin dipped slightly, an acknowledgement, not quite acceptance, but perhaps the beginning of it. As Miss Marple made her way back toward the high street, she passed the Tremble household. Alice's bedroom window was open, the curtains fluttered faintly, and the girl sat at her writing desk, pen in hand. Miss Marple saw no movement, only stillness, the stillness of someone finally putting something into words they could no longer keep inside. She did not stop. She did not need to. That evening, a letter arrived at Miss Marple's cottage. No signature, no stamp, just a single sheet of lined paper, folded twice. "I know I must leave the village, but I wanted to say thank you. Not for forgiveness, just for understanding that I was never trying to be cruel, only brave. And I failed. I'll try to be better. Somewhere else. I think that's the most I can promise now." Miss Marple folded the letter, tucked it into the inside flap of her gardening journal, and returned to her tea. She didn't cry. She didn't sigh. She only sat quietly, listening to the tick of the clock. In St. Aldred's, justice had no courtroom, only tea trays and torn samplers, half-truths and quiet reckonings. And sometimes that was punishment enough. Chapter 12. A week after the inquest, a discreet envelope arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, this one properly stamped, properly signed. The return address read, County Constabulary Headquarters, B Division. Inside, folded with bureaucratic neatness, was a short letter from Inspector Crail. Dear Miss Marple, as expected, the inquiry into Miss Tremble's involvement has been concluded. Based on the evidence and the coroner's ruling, no criminal charges will be pursued. The death remains classified as a misadventure. Miss Tremble has since left the village. Her parents report she has joined relatives in Wiltshire and intends to continue her education in a private programme there. I trust this outcome will not surprise you. Yours sincerely, Inspector Lionel Crail. Miss Marple read it once. Then again, she let out a small breath that wasn't quite relief, but something close to it. There had been no need for spectacle, no final confrontation in a crowded hall. Just a letter, stamped and sealed, tying the last thread to its end. That afternoon, Miss Marple strolled to the churchyard. The sky above St. Aldred's was unusually clear, and the wind had turned crisp with the first whisper of autumn. A new notice had been posted on the chapel bulletin board. Mrs. Banbury Scott, perhaps eager to reassert control, had organised a stitching society gathering in honour of peaceful times and fresh beginnings. The words were carefully chosen. There was no mention of Gilda, no mention of Alice. Just a suggestion of resilience, couched in polite euphemism. Miss Marple lingered near the edge of the cemetery path, where a few rows of older graves stood, shaded by yew trees. A modest stone had been added, temporary for now. It bore Gilda Crowthorne's name, and the simple inscription, "Remembered with Grace." She regarded it thoughtfully. Grace, she knew, was not something Gilda had always lived with, nor perhaps had she died with it. But the words were as much for the villagers as they were for the dead. A tidy phrase, a neat finish. Still, she couldn't help but notice that someone had left a rose on the stone. A single red rose, embroidered from fabric, stiff with careful stitching. Tied to the stem was a card. No signature, no message, just a name written in delicate script. Alice Miss Marple didn't touch it. She let it rest there, an offering not of absolution, but memory. As she made her way back down the gravel path, she saw Isabel Hawthorne trimming back the hedge near the lich gate. The two women exchanged nods, nothing more. Some things, after all, were better left unsaid. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple resumed her seat near the window and returned to her knitting. Something plain and serviceable this time. No roses, no flair. Just a comforting rhythm of row upon row. A few moments later, the kettle hissed. She rose, poured her tea, and sat once more. She didn't reflect on guilt or punishment, or even the fragility of the truth. Instead, she thought of how easily lives fray under the surface, how even the smallest stitch, misplaced, misused, can unravel a life, and how, with time, even the deepest tangle can be mended, not erased, but understood. The village would forget in time. It always did. Faces would soften, names would shift into gossip, then silence. But she would remember, because that was what she did. She watched, she listened, and when the world wove its mysteries, Miss Marple untangled them, one thread at a time. The end.